Okay. So.
Want to start?
Yeah.
Just tell me what.
Yeah, it's on. It's last time we.
Well, my experience in Japan was, I suppose, the most spectacular experience of my career. We landed in Japan, as I said last time, with our gas masks and our guns, expecting resistance, and we found no resistance at all. On the contrary, we found a very complacent population bowing to us, greeting us, and so on. I first was housed in what used to be a barracks of the equivalent of the West Point of Japan. Camp Osama, it was called, outside of Tokyo. It was in the winter. It was October when we landed. It was quite cold. Tokyo can be very cold and very hot in the summer. But this was very cold, and we had nothing but cots. Our blankets hadn't arrived. We were so cold that we slept with newspapers. We had newspapers at the bottom, and we had newspapers covering us at the top to keep us warm. Finally, the blankets arrived, and things weren't so bad. My first assignment was up to Saitama Prefecture, which was one of the large, more prosperous prefectures in Japan. And there I was attached to the 1st Cavalry Division. Now, the 1st Cavalry Division was, as is indicated, cavalry. And a good many of the officers still wore their jodhpurs and spurs, even though they hadn't been on a horse for a long time. But they still wore them, and they carried their swagger sticks. Though they had been converted tanks instead of horses, they became an armored division. But they still thought of themselves as a very swaggering, and it was a very swaggering kind of outfit. It was commanded by a General Bradford Chase. Well, a group of military government officers, were attached, as we called it in the Army, to the 1st Cavalry Division. Now, the 1st Cavalry was very proud of its reputation as a fighting group which had come on up from Australia, on up into the Philippines, and into Japan. And they had great public relations. They had billboards all over Japan, in English actually. It's the 1st Cavalry Division, 1st in Manila, and 1st in Tokyo. And I told this to General Eichelberger. Now, I should amplify this. General Eichelberger was in command of the 8th Army in Yokohama. 8th Army is, of course, superior to a division, as you may know. You have an army and a corps and a division. So General Robert Eichelberger was the commanding general. He was a lieutenant general in command of the 8th Army. And interestingly enough, when he retired to Asheville, North Carolina. And he decided, I helped persuade him actually with someone else, to leave his papers to Duke University, which he did. So he came here to Duke a couple of times, and I had lunch with him, and I told him the story. I said, General Eichelberger, the 1st Cavalry Division was under your command, and they were very proud of their reputation of coming up from Manila, the 1st in Manila, 1st in Tokyo. He said, yes. He said, but what General Bradford Chase didn't tell you was the 1st Cavalry Division, 1st in Manila and 1st in Tokyo, and 1st in the venereal disease rate. He said he didn't tell you that. He didn't care much for the 1st Cavalry Division, and he didn't care much for their swaggering manner. Well, Bradford Chase met with his officers, the division officers, including us, the military government officers. There were, I think, a group of maybe 20 of us, as I recall, maybe 20 or 30. Attached to his division, and he didn't like us at all because he was a combat officer, and he said, well, we've got this bunch of sissies attached to us. He actually called us sissies in public. What he didn't know was most of the military government officers had seen combat. I did not, but most of the others had seen combat in Europe against the Germans actually, and then they were transferred from Germany to Japan. He didn't know that. He just didn't like us. Well, my first assignment was to travel throughout the prefecture to Chinese prisoner of war camps and release the Chinese prisoners of war. I have pictures of these prisoners of war, and that was quite sad. I was with 3 Chinese generals from the Kuomintang, General Chiang Kai-shek's organization. And one of them spoke Japanese because he was trained in Japan, ironically, and the other spoke a little bit of English. And then I was accompanied by an interpreter who was much better at Japanese than I was, though I was pretty good at Japanese, but I couldn't interpret the subtleties of the language. So we traveled by train with the Chinese generals. The trains were not heated. They burned wood for the most part, and the cars weren't heated. It was terribly cold. So we had what was called the Japanese hibachi, which is a pot, a big ceramic pot, in which charcoal is burned. And we had one of these hibachis in the car, and we'd warm our hands over it, and then we would wire ahead to the next station, and they'd bring in a new hibachi or more charcoal, and we put it on, so we kept warm that way. Well, we went to the prisoner of war camps, and these prisoners were lined up. They were blinded. I don't know to this day whether the Japanese deliberately blinded them, or whether they were suffering from glaucoma. But it is strange that in the prisoner of war camp, consisting of maybe 30 to 50 prisoners, all of them were blind, and all of them carried sticks. I have the pictures to prove that in my file there on Japan. And as I say, I don't know to this day how they got blind, but it is rather strange that all of them should be blind at the same time. It's conceivable they all had glaucoma, severe cases, but
It could have been experimented on.
it could have been experimented on. I think now, as I look back on it, I have a feeling that the Japanese somehow blinded them in some way, as you suggest, possibly through experimentation, possibly just for a kind of vengeance. Well, the Chinese generals were furious when they saw these Chinese prisoners of war. They carried, of course, revolvers at their side, as I did. We all had 45 caliber pistols. And they would see these Chinese prisoners all lined up, and they would take out their pistols and want to shoot the Japanese right on the spot. And I had to restrain them, sometimes taking them by the arm and putting their arm down so they put the pistol back in the holder, but they were furious. So they made a nice speech to the prisoners saying that they were being released now, and that China welcomed them back and things would be better for them and so on, but oh, how they hated the Japanese. So we visited, I think, 3 or 4, as I recall, 3 or 4 prisoner of war camps, releasing those prisoners to the Chinese generals, put them on the train, and they were sent back to China. But that was quite an interesting experience, and it was my first contact with the Chinese. My next assignment was to release the internees, the diplomatic internees, most of whom were German. Some were Swiss. They, of course, were friends, as you know. They were allies with the Japanese during the war. But as soon as we won the war, they became internees, diplomatic internees, which is a diplomatic term for prisoner. They were under house arrest, so to speak. So I had to visit them. Most of the Germans spoke pretty good English, and release them, and they would be sent back to Germany. Then I had to visit the homes of generals who had gone out of the army to seize their swords, confiscate their swords, because the sword was regarded as a symbol of the samurai spirit. And one of the aims of the occupation was to demilitarize the Japanese. That was the official expression used, the demilitarization of Japan, and part of that embraced taking the swords. So I visited the Japanese generals, and we were very polite. We had tea together and so on. The war was at an end, and they would present me with their swords, and I would bring the swords back to headquarters. Now, one of the things I regret, we were allowed to keep a sword. The Japanese sword is a souvenir. Each officer could have one sword. And what I regret was not taking a sword. The truth of the matter is that I hated war so much, and I hated the violence suggested by swords and guns, that I did not bring a sword back with me. And that's something which I regret, because it make a wonderful souvenir. Most of my colleagues did. They took a sword. I might have done, but I failed to do it. That's one of the regrets I had. Then I remember, still in that division, the 1st Cavalry Division, walking along the barrack road one day, and a major general was coming toward me, and he saw me, and he said, "Lieutenant, stand at attention." I stood at attention. He said, "You've got a button unbuttoned." Well, I didn't know that. I looked down and I had a button unbuttoned, which was unusual for me because I was usually a very strict and meticulous officer myself. Now he bawled me out. He said, "You Signal Corps people are all alike. You're just a bunch of no-goods." And he called us all kinds of names. I wondered what in the world was the trouble. He said, "I want you to report to my Chief of Staff immediately." Well, I was scared to death because he was a Major General and I didn't know what I had done. So I reported to the Chief of Staff, who was a colonel, who was very nice. He said, "Lieutenant, I want to apologize for the general." He said, "You know, we've had a lot of trouble with our Signal Corps company. You see, each division had a Signal Corps company. And I happened to be commissioned in the Signal Corps, so I was wearing the flags on my lapel." He said, "The general thought that you were in the Signal Corps company, and he has it in for the Signal Corps company." He said he didn't realize that you're a military government officer. So he said, I want to apologize in his behalf. And he said, "I want you to take this as a souvenir." And he gave me a German Luger pistol as a souvenir, and by way of apology. Naturally, the general himself would not apologize, but he had his Chief of Staff apologize for it. I went back to the barracks. I looked at that Luger pistol, and again, as I told you, I hated pistols. I disliked swords. And the second regret I have is that I gave that Luger pistol away to another officer. Again, they have become very valuable souvenirs since the end of the war, and I could have kept that Luger pistol. And again, that would have been a very nice souvenir, but I gave it away. So that shows you my attitude toward weapons generally, even though I was forced to carry a pistol at my side all the time during the early part of Japan. Still, I disliked them very much. So my next assignment was to Yamanashi Prefecture. Now here I have to backtrack a bit. When I was at the School of Military Government in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, we had lectures on public health in Japan. They were really very good. They were given by the Dean of the School of Public Health at Yale University, who was commissioned in the Army for the specific purpose of teaching us these things. And he lectured to us, and he had a great big map. He lectured to us about various diseases in Japan. And he talked about a disease which he gave a name to, called schistosomiasis. I was fascinated by that name, just as I'm fascinated by the name of my chairlift, Epaminondas. I was fascinated by the disease called schistosomiasis. And he said, "This is a terrible disease in Japan. You have to watch out for it." And he pointed at the map and he said, "The highest incidence or rate of schistosomiasis is in the prefecture of Yamanashi." Well, that didn't mean much to me, but the word schistosomiasis meant a good deal. Schistosomiasis is a disease which comes from the snail. The snail is the carrier. And then there's a fluke, and it invades the kidneys and the liver, and it's a fatal disease, so it's very bad indeed. He said, "You find it in Yamanashi." Lo and behold, I was assigned to Yamanashi as my prefecture. The prefecture with the highest rate of schistosomiasis. Well, when I first went, I was alone in Yamanashi, which was a wonderful experience. I went there alone, replacing a company of 96 men, and I had to set up the whole military government all by myself as a lieutenant, which I did. I went to the governor, I took over the governor's office. I went to the police chief. I told the police chief I wanted guards around my vehicles. I had 2 men, 1 Jeep, and 2 3/4-ton trucks, which is like your car. And I went to the police chief and said, I need guards for my motor pool. Police chief spoke good English. He said, I thought since you're trying to teach us democracy, you trust everybody and you don't need a guard. I thought that was quite an interesting reaction in the early days of the occupation. Mind you, I was the first American he had seen. I said, no, we still need guards to guard the motor pool. So he set out some guards. I took over an office. I took over a building, a painting of which I have, where we were to live. It was actually the building, the headquarters of the Prefectural Medical Association. I took over that building for quarters, and I was alone for some 2 or 3 months operating the military government. When a major then came in, so I became his assistant, I became his chief of staff, and the major was in charge. He was really quite good, though he was, strangely enough, a salesman for bottle tops in Chicago, milk bottle tops. And he had been in the National Guard. The National Guard was not thought very well of, but he was quite a good man. He came in. He was not trained in military government. And again, I was lucky because since I was a trained military government officer, even though I was now second in command, I in effect ran everything, which was still a very good experience for me. Subsequently, our unit built up to about 6 officers, and I was the chief of staff or the adjutant. And again, I was the only trained military government officer. I was the only one who could speak some Japanese, so I had a wonderful situation. I served under 3 different commanding officers. Major Nestler was quite a good man. Then he was succeeded by a Major Andrade, who came from the ROTC in Hawaii, University of Honolulu. He had been a football player on the University of Honolulu team. He was quite good. We became very good friends, though he was an alcoholic. But nevertheless, we became friendly. I, as you know, did not drink at all during that, ever in my life. He was succeeded by someone else who was a real alcoholic, who was drunk all day. So again, that was a great advantage to me because I could do everything. And the things they had to sign, I just handed them the papers and they signed them. Sometimes they didn't.